Tartaria, or Tartary, is a name that appears frequently across a wide array of historical maps from the 16th to the 19th centuries, often covering large swathes of northern and central Asia, including areas today considered part of Russia, China, and Mongolia. The term has become a point of contention in modern historical investigations. The mainstream academic consensus views Tartary as a loosely defined region used by Western cartographers to describe parts of Asia that were unfamiliar or only partially documented. Yet the regularity and scope of the name's presence, combined with its abrupt disappearance from maps and historical literature, has spurred alternative interpretations. In this section, the investigation begins by outlining the contours of what is referred to as the Tartaria question. Was Tartaria simply a placeholder for European ignorance, or was it the cartographic residue of a forgotten empire? The task at hand is not to validate or debunk Tartaria as a real civilization outright, but to understand the mechanisms by which it entered and exited the historical record. The initial approach centers on the cartographic archive, tracing the evolution of how the region was represented on maps. The objective is to establish the baseline from which anomalies can be identified. What stands out immediately is the sheer consistency with which Tartary appears on maps spanning centuries, often occupying prime geographical space with significant territorial boundaries, cities, and features. These depictions, though inconsistent in detail, suggest a perception of cohesion, not of an empty wilderness or a terra incognita. It is important to emphasize that Tartaria is not presented in these maps as a mythical realm akin to Atlantis or El Dorado. Instead, it is depicted with names of regions, rivers, cities, and in some cases, suggested trade routes. This level of specificity creates tension with the notion that it was merely a label for unknown lands. Furthermore, its disappearance is not gradual but sudden. By the late 19th century, the term vanishes almost entirely from major atlases and encyclopedias. This abrupt transition invites scrutiny. What caused this change? Did the underlying geopolitical structure dissolve, or did the narrative infrastructure of empire overwrite a competing historical memory? To begin a methodical investigation, one must establish the interplay between geography, power, and knowledge. Cartography is not a neutral activity. Maps are cultural documents shaped by the political, religious, and economic interests of their creators. A name on a map is not just a reference point, it is a statement of recognition, of conceptual existence. Conversely, the removal of a name is an erasure, whether accidental or intentional. By this logic, the appearance and disappearance of Tartaria are not trivial anomalies, but potential clues pointing to shifts in who gets to define reality. Another layer of complexity arises when one considers that Tartaria was not depicted on maps of a single origin. Its presence is found in Dutch, French, British, German, and Italian cartographic traditions. This suggests a shared consensus, or at least a shared convention, across national boundaries. If it was a placeholder born of ignorance, why was it applied so uniformly and retained for so long? If it was meant to be a general term for land of the Tatars, why did the specifics of its geography remain relatively stable, even as the European understanding of Asia deepened? The issue extends beyond maps. Contemporary texts, travelogues, and early encyclopedic works refer to Tartaria with varying degrees of certainty. Sometimes it is linked to the Mongol Empire or the broader region ruled by Genghis Khan's descendants. At other times, it is presented as an autonomous civilization with its own customs and structures. The inconsistency in narrative, however, does not dilute the central observation. The name persists, often with a tone of recognition rather than myth. This section also frames the central methodological constraint. Historical knowledge is filtered through institutions with vested interests. The Enlightenment, the colonial era, and the subsequent scientific age prioritized specific forms of evidence while excluding others. Oral traditions, anomalous artifacts, and unconventional interpretations were sidelined in favor of linear, document-based narratives. Within this context, Tartaria's marginalization becomes intelligible not as a correction of error, but as a reconfiguration of acceptable knowledge. There is, of course, the risk of overinterpretation. Not every omission is sinister, and not every anomaly signals a hidden truth. But the investigation gains relevance from its broader implications. If a name like Tartaria can dominate maps for centuries, and then vanish without substantial historical commentary, what does that suggest about the reliability of official history? If there was once a political or cultural entity occupying that space, what mechanisms contributed to its conceptual deletion? The inquiry thus begins with an acknowledgement